The CyberHub Engage podcast is sponsored by CyberHub Summit. CyberHub Summit is hosting an executive retreat summit March 2nd through the 4th in Napa Valley. Apply today at cyberhubsummit.com. Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage. We've got a great episode coming up with Brian Lozada, the CISO for ZocDoc, which is the third fastest growing startup in the country, ZocDoc.com. I just want to give you this intro before we get started with the podcast. This was the first podcast we did by phone, so the audio is great. There's a little bit of background noise, and we apologize about that, but I kind of wanted to give you a warning before you listen. The content is amazing. Brian shared so many great things, so I apologize for some of the background noise. We tried to get rid of as much of it in after, but thanks for listening, and stay tuned. We're going to get started with Brian here in just a sec. Thanks. Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. I'm your host, James Azar, and if you're not following us yet on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, you don't understand what you're missing out on. So make sure you look us up, CyberHub Engage. We have a awesome show for you guys today. So I'm doing this by phone because I couldn't make it out to New York, and I wanted to because the energy that our guest has and the knowledge that he has, it's the kind of young energy we all crave, and in an industry like cybersecurity, it's these fresh ideas and these fresh thoughts that bring about change. And we're on our series of speaking to the younger CISOs, and with that I want to introduce our guest for today, Brian Lozada, the CISO for ZocDoc, which is one of the third fastest growing startup in the country. Hey Brian, how's it going?
Great, James. Thanks for having me.
Hey, man, pleasure. Listen, dude, I love your energy, right? So, like, every conversation with you, I can't sit down. I got to, talk and walk. And so I'll be doing that throughout our podcast today. So, but you and I have, chatted before, and, you're obviously a Semper Fi brother. So thank you for your service. And, but before we kind of get into cyber, why don't you just share with us a little bit about your background and how you ended up at ZocDoc? Because you got an awesome resume, man.
Great. Once again, James, thanks. I appreciate it. I appreciate that I bring you energy. You bring me energy as well. So I'll talk a little bit about my background. You mentioned it earlier, Semper Fi. I was in the Marine Corps, and when I got out of the Marine Corps and I went back to school, I was looking for what path I wanted to go. And I knew at that point that I wanted to do technology. I got out of the Marine Corps back in 2003. I wanted to go into technology. And I sat with a professor, and he said, you know what, you have a lot of discipline, a lot of structure, that military discipline. I think an area for you would be, information security and cybersecurity. So I actually ended up getting my degree. My undergrad is in actual information security, which is, this is 15 years ago. So that's how and you think about it now, you have all these universities that are starving to actually put these programs out there. So it was good. I started right out of college in the industry. The first job I ever had was with Accenture. And when they saw my profile, and they were like, hey, you still have an active security clearance, we would love for you to come on board. Right after I got my degree, and I actually started consulting and doing a lot of stuff for Accenture around pen testing, getting into different environments, understanding a lot of different networks. At that particular time, it gave me that experience of transitioning from military to civilian. So I kind of needed that. I needed to bounce around a little bit and see that area. Right after that, I started working for Vonage. This was back in 2005, 2006. So at that time, Vonage was still private. Vonage was a startup doing voice over IP. They had 2 or 3 million customers a month paying with credit cards. So when I got there, it was all about, let's make sure we have good security, good compliance. But PCI came out. And for all you guys that remember PCI, when it first came out, it was very tough for organizations to actually align to it or even really understand it. So I spent a good 3 years at Vonage, getting their compliance in order, making sure they were ready for PCI, which we became level 1 compliant, got our ROC. After that, I decided to just switch paths a little bit, and I went to go work for Sony Music. Going into media entertainment was a lot of fun. I wanted to try that environment because at that particular time, I had experience in information security, but I had it in a very structured format. And going into Sony Music, it was very different because it's the creative workforce. It's dealing with different labels, different music labels, dealing with how they create that music product and then put that out there. And this is back in 2008, 2009, when who buys CDs? Everything was all about digital distribution. Everything was like, how do we transition our business from selling, physical CDs to getting it direct to the consumer via online means? So that was very exciting for me. So if you look at like some of the Sony Music websites right now, like you could go to BritneySpears.com and actually download an album directly or download one song versus how it was 20 years ago. You actually had to buy a physical CD just for one song. So that was a lot of fun. The other thing, that was my first exposure to the cloud. I started using AWS and EC2 at Sony Music. So I spent almost 3 years at Sony Music heading up their security. And then right after that, I stayed in media and entertainment. I went to go work for Condé Nast. Condé Nast is Vogue, GQ, Allure, Vanity Fair, all of those big publications and big magazines. They were going through the same transition because who buys magazines anymore? Everything was all about digital distribution and how do they get that product out to the consumer. So I was hired by a gentleman by the name of Joe Simon, who was the CTO at Viacom, and then he became CTO over at Condé Nast. Same type of approach. Each magazine has their own creative environment, and that can't be disrupted. So intertwining information security into that environment so that you don't slow down that creative process or alter that creative process. If we were to do that, security never would have been successful in any one of the media companies because they just don't want to change that process. So understanding how the cover of Vogue is actually started, where it's stored, who has access, how it's being transitioned over to the photo house, to get cleaned up before it gets sent out to print or before it gets sent out to digital distribution, right? Understanding that entire life cycle and then putting controls around that environment, not to slow it down, but just to stop leaks or make sure that nobody's touching that type of stuff. So I was there for about close to 4 years. Another big project that we had at Condé Nast was shutting down all data centers and going 100% AWS. I think Condé was one of the first media companies ever to do that and operate 100% out of the cloud environment. And I mean, even back office systems like ERP and PeopleSoft. After that, I threw my hat into financial services and went to go work for Abacus Group, which is the largest cloud provider for financial services in the world, specifically dealing with like hedge funds and private equity. That environment was fun, but again, it got me back into that structured environment, which I didn't align to at that point. After spending so many years in media and entertainment and startups, going back to that was just didn't really fit in what I wanted to do. Didn't have that cutting edge innovation that I wanted. Still a lot of fun. Still was able to bring a lot of hedge funds into the cloud, which is think about financial services in the cloud. It just doesn't really happen, right? And then ZocDoc came calling. So ZocDoc being, one of the biggest startups out there right now. We get about 7 million patients a month that visit our website to actually do a simple thing, just like booking a doctor's appointment. Because if you think about the 21st century patient, who actually wants to pick up the phone and call a doctor? Nobody wants to pick up the phone anymore. So ZocDoc offers that marketplace that you could actually just go out there, search the doctor that fits your needs, and book on demand right there. So we're kind of like the open table for healthcare right now.
But you can also review the doctor, right? Like you can see like other people's experience with that specific healthcare provider.
Absolutely. So we offer that just like Open Table and all those things. This is the experience that other patients have had with this doctor. Does it align to your personality? Is this something that you're looking for, right? We give patients options. So if you look at the average, this is 2018. This is insane, actually, y'all. The average U.S. patient, it takes them 24 days from the moment they pick up the phone to the moment they get into the doctor's office. This is 2018. That's crazy. That's actually that long.
It seems like Canada. It seems like almost like socialist medicine.
The average ZocDoc patient, from the moment they start looking for a doctor to the moment they go into the doctor's office, is 24 hours. So we cut that time down dramatically.
When you're sick, that 24 hour to 24 day window is quite significant.
Absolutely.
So you have a very impressive resume, Brian. You've obviously done a wide array of things. I think one of the things I'm really interested though is how do you really, there's a lot of CISOs out there who have to deal with creative folks. And having you worked with two creative companies, Sony and Condé Nast, how did you manage to get security kind of implemented across an organization while still kind of maintaining that creativity? What are some of the things you did?
So the first thing I did was understanding their work environment. That was the first thing, because you catch more bees with honey than you do with vinegar. So you actually have to get embedded into their workflow. So understanding what they're doing from a day to day, so that when you actually propose something to actually help with security, for example, at Conde, we were digitally fingerprinting the images that were going to go out to print or go out to digital. And how we did that was understanding from the moment that the picture is actually taken, where it's stored, who has access to it. That whole process of from the moment it gets created to the moment it gets cleaned up and delivered, let's just understand that first. And then once we understand that, talk to the creative folks and say, this is what we want to do to ensure that these images don't get leaked. And that could be adding access control or adding this digital watermark so that we know if it does get leaked, where we need to tighten up our environment. So the thing for us was offering our services as an add-on or a value add to their work product. And a lot of creative folks get it at that point. If you try to tell a creative workforce, you have to do X or you must do Y, you will never be able to accomplish that partnership. So the big thing for me was to establish the office of the CISO and visualize it as a partner to the business. So say, we value your work product. We understand what you're doing is valuable. We just want to be able to be embedded in that so that we can improve your work product from a security perspective. It was very well received when you offer it that way, instead of trying to put creative folks into a box. It'll never work if you try to put them into a box.
Right. That brings mutiny. I mean, you've kind of done a lot of different CISO roles in new companies, kind of building it. So I think now you're on number 3, if I'm not mistaken. So what were some of the things, what are the top 3 things you looked at as a new CISO going into every new role that you were going to, where you were building the CISO role? What were those 3 things you were looking at?
The first thing that I wanted to understand was the mission of the company. What is the company trying to accomplish, right? Because when you look at that objective of what they're trying to accomplish, it's always going to tie back to how security can help with that mission. So that was the first thing. The second thing was understanding where, and this is probably a key thing probably for all CISOs, is where those digital assets or that information is, the life cycle of that information, because that's where you're going to focus the majority of your attention right now. This is where the sensitive digital assets are, or digital assets that you don't know if they're sensitive yet. They haven't been classified, or there hasn't been a framework around it. Understand where it is and understand the life cycle from the moment it gets into your environment to the moment it gets stored, processed, transmitted, and destroyed. Just figure out where that is so that you can start focusing your attention and putting your program and adjusting your program around that life cycle. And then the third thing is people. When I go into environments, look, they could have infrastructure already built. They could have things that aren't already built. The 2 areas that I look at is data and people. I look at data, the life cycle of the data, and then people. How are people accessing that data? How are they creating that data? Why are they looking at that data, right? Once you understand those 2 areas, you could really build your program and say, I am not going to slow them down if I do this, or I'm going to augment their current process by doing X, but at the same time increasing security, or at least increasing visibility, so that in the event that something negative does happen, you have that ability to respond. So I focus my area on data and people.
So you bring up 3 very good points here, and those kind of translate to, you look at a CISO as a business unit rather than an expense line item. So how do you bring that shift to the CISO marketplace in terms of how do we transition CISOs from being an expense line item to the CFO and everyone else to being a business unit that can actually be a business unit? What are some of the tips and how did how can you contribute? How can a CISO contribute more to the business in that aspect?
That's a great question. And if you've seen over the past few years, that shift is starting to happen. It's happened a lot, actually.
Right.
And how it's happening is you see all of these issues that are out there in the news when these companies take a compromise. the brand damage that it happens, right? So the brand gets impacted to such an extent that it impacts the bottom line, impacts consumer trust, impacts your ability to partner with advertisers or partner with other companies. So bringing that to the business on a day-to-day basis and saying any product that you're trying to develop or any solution that you're trying to put out there, there is a risk associated to it, and then quantifying that risk. Some risk can't be quantified at a dollar value, right? Brand risk can't be quantified at a dollar value, but just bringing that awareness back to the business, that helps align security to where they're trying to go and saying, well, security needs to be involved in this product, so that this product launch, so that we know that we're doing the right things for implementation, maintenance, and putting it out to our consumers. So it's raising the awareness of where security could be that value add. The other thing is, if you look at the 21st century consumer right now, they expect security to be part of their experience, right? So highlighting that our users want this, they need this, they're expecting this. And if we as a company don't do this, those consumers will go somewhere else. So that's the other area that you need to highlight and make that awareness, visible for the business.
Well, do you, I mean, so when you talk to, from a CISO side, the argument you make is very, very valid. But let's kind of switch that to the CEO side, right? So when you look at the history of different cyber breaches that have happened from Equifax, Home Depot, and that list can go on and on and on and on, right? You don't really, you see an impact on the stock price, bottom line, but here we are, Equifax, literally you and I are talking now, it's September. A year ago, this breach was discovered. Stock price is back to where it was before the breach. So do you really feel like on a business side, the CEOs see that the same way you do, or as a CISO, or do you see that concern kind of being diminished to going, all right, so we're going to have a rough year or two, but then we're going to get right back up there?
And that's a risk tolerance. That's something that the CEO can take, that say, I understand and I'm willing to take that risk. But from a CISO's perspective, always trying to push that and making sure that the CEO is actually aware of what risks they're willing to take and the brand impact that they're willing to take. Look, there's going to be trade-offs here and there. That's the other thing with CISOs. If you look how CISOs were 15 years ago, they were the office of no, the office of zero innovation. Don't go down that product line. Don't try to do, and that pushed security out of that innovation cycle. So you have to have that balance, that you're saying you give enough visibility and awareness to the CEO or those decision makers from a risk perspective to say they are willing to take that risk. They're willing to have mitigations prepared if that risk happens. That would include CISOs and legal, or they're willing to actually mitigate the risk and say, hey, I'm going to take care of this now. I think that's CISOs were always going to struggle with that, whether it's now or many years to come. It's just our job to make sure that awareness is there so that those decision makers have enough data from a risk perspective to make that decision.
You kind of you bring up the risk mitigation and how much risk a company is willing to take and a CEO is willing to take. The counter argument to that, and I always like to play both sides against each other. But the counter argument to that is, when something does happen, I don't care how much risk a CEO decided to take. Typically, the CISO is the first one on the chopping block, and I don't care how many times he screamed wolf.
Yep, that's absolutely true. But that comes back, and I don't want to get into
I don't want to get
negative.
Neither do I. But it's
true.
It's what the listener, the CISO who's listening to our conversation right now, in his head, he's going, you're right, and I've dealt with these guys, but then when something does happen, I'm the first one whose resignation they're asking for.
Absolutely, and that is true, right? And that does happen a lot. I heard a joke not too long ago that CISO stands for Chief Information Scapegoat Officer, right? So you're the first one that goes out. But as CISOs, and as we are elevating that awareness to the CEO and those decision makers on risk, it's our job as well to document this, to make this incredibly aware to not just the CEO, but to those other stakeholders within the company that are going to also be talking to the CEO. We're also going to be driving product or infrastructure changes, right?
Right.
So we need to make this aware to say, we had that executive team, that team had that data available from the office of the CISO to make that decision. So even if you do take that hit, right, and CISOs are going to take that hit, that diligence is done and it is, candidly discoverable.
So that's a very valid point. And, since we're talking about the subject of, talking to other stakeholders in a company, one of the big complaints that you hear from chief information security officers is, man, I've got a tight budget. I'm not getting the budget I'm asking for. I'm not even getting remotely anywhere near it. Or if you get the budget, if the company's over budget, you're typically the first guy to get cut. You're like, hey, how much money do you have left in your budget? Great, we're taking it. How do you tackle that? What are some of the ways you kind of ask for a budget, and what are the ways you kind of ensure that you maintain that budget over the long term?
So there's two. I've experienced it in so many different ways. And there were times that me as a CISO, I was reporting into technology, so that was challenging because then my budget was always tied to the technology budget, right? And then there were times that I reported to other areas where my budget tied into that. So it's fighting for and articulating to those decision makers why security needs their own budget, right? It's not like we're going to be driving a lot of innovation out of our budget. But what we are going to do is that innovation or whatever products or solution that the company is actually driving, that we have some sort of ability to nurture that with these tools that we're going to be procuring, or these resources that are going to help during that process. I think the other area is you have to build allies. I pride myself in partnerships. Every organization that I've been to, I've established the office of the CISO, and I make it so that these business units come to the office of the CISO when they are starting to actually either think of a product or think of a new area that they want to get into, so they can start thinking about, as I'm developing this product, what is the budget I need to support it? And that's where security starts being included into it. So it might come out of that business unit's budget, but we will support, maintain, and help, that tool go throughout that life cycle, if that makes sense.
Are you starting to see more of that action across, some of the larger enterprises where, the office of the chief information security officer is more of a, hey, we want to build this app. How should we address security from the very beginning? And then it's budgeted within essentially that department's area?
It is. I have, over the past 6 years of my career, that's how I've operated. I've seen a lot of other companies take that approach. A lot of technology companies, newer technology companies, are taking that approach as well, is that these things need to be accountable down to those departments. The office of the CISO is just providing that guidance and that help. And even if it's from a tool perspective, that maintenance of that tool throughout that life cycle.
You bring up something that's really interesting, because we're talking about budgeting. And one of the things I always keep hearing about, and the conversations, I'm having, and, you and I've had this conversation, is automation, right? So trying to automate as much as possible from cybersecurity to try and, inflate the budget. Where are you on automation? What do you want to see in automation?
So from my perspective, the biggest thing that I would like to see with automation is, if you look at the cybersecurity industry, right now we are starving for talent. We are starving for those folks to help us out as we mature our programs. So I would like to see a lot more automation around the remediation aspect of it. That we, as CISOs, we have vendor fatigue. We hear from vendors that they're going to be able to solve all of our problems. But when you double click on these vendors and you actually see what they're giving you a lot of good information, but no action around it. They're saying, this is happening. Great, this is happening. How am I going to fix it if I don't have the resources that's going to investigate, monitor, alert, then go put in the remediation aspect of it, right? You're giving me half of the solution, but I've been dealing with that for the past 25 years, in this industry. So I want to see a lot more, vendors and a lot more automation around the actual remediation piece of it. Look, you're not going to be able to take that human element out of that completely, but you could get 95% there. Simple things that we're seeing in the environment that we've been seeing for the past 20 years, that we could actually put some automatic remediation against blocking, protecting, actually spinning up and spinning down new services if you're in the cloud. Those things should be our focus area when it comes to cybersecurity.
And that brings me to the next question, because you and I were having a conversation, and you actually almost develop your own security products instead of using vendors. What gives in that? I mean, what's behind it?
So in at ZocDoc's case, we are 100% cloud. We operate 100% in a cloud environment, candidly in AWS. And what we've started to realize is the AWS and these cloud providers, not just AWS, all cloud providers offer services that you could take advantage of to help improve the platform. And now they're starting to offer a lot more from a security perspective. So we started analyzing all of these security features that they're offering, from vulnerability management to DDoS protection to just how to harden an environment. And we looked at all of this and said, how can we automate this? How can we actually make this so that my staff isn't spending, X amount of dollars and X amount of time actually doing it? And also so that I don't have to have the SRE team actually do this or the DevOps team actually do this, right? I want this just to be part of the platform. So for example, like we use the AWS platform. We get a lot of logs of anything that our developers are doing. We then picked out and said, these are the logs that for us were a risk. This is something that should not be allowed on our platform. For example, unencrypted S3 buckets, right? So if a developer actually spins up an unencrypted S3 bucket, that spits out a log. So we took that log, we sent it through some systems that AWS offers, from CloudWatch and CloudTrail, and we said, once we find that this S3 bucket has been created, let's create what's called the Lambda function to go encrypt that S3 bucket all automatically. No intervention from anybody. It's just our stance, our policy is no unencrypted S3 buckets are to be created out of the ZocDoc environment. So if one does happen, the system itself finds it, goes out there, encrypts it, and then lets us know, right? That automation is what we wanted for across all of our products. That's just a simple one that we've created, but we have other ones. Like if there's some sort of malicious activity on one of our servers, we have tools that detect that actually can then go do the same type of loop, but instead of cleaning the system, we believe in immutable technology. We're immutable infrastructure. We actually spin down that server completely, and then we spin it back up with a hardened image with that system already cleaned. No longer is it the day of let me look what's going on in this environment, and I have to actually go to this server and see how. No, if it's an actual compromise, we're just going to spin it down and spin a brand new clean version up. Again, all automatically, not spending time on my resources or anybody to actually go through that whole process, which could take days. This can take minutes. Big difference.
And you couldn't find something like this in the market, essentially.
We couldn't find something in the market it would do half.
Right.
It wouldn't do the actual remediation. It would tell us, something's wrong here. Great. Thank you for telling me something. Something's always going to be wrong. And I think I have enough tools that are going to tell me that something's going to be wrong. What I want are tools that are focusing on fixing the issue, right? Not just, telling me that something's wrong. The other thing is, when we don't have the resources to say that, like you get a tool that says, hey, this is something wrong, the resources to actually double click on that, figure it out, investigate, and then take that step, it's a long time. And that risk can then propagate even more. But if I have this done from a remediation perspective automatically, I save so much time and reduce that risk dramatically for the organization.
So that kind of brings me to the next point I want to talk to you about, which is, you've worked in large companies. ZocDoc's a startup, so I'm sure it's a bit more of a constrained company, even though it's very successful. But, you've got to comply, at ZocDoc at least, you've got a ton of regulations, right? From HIPAA to high trust to so many different others that you have to deal with. And how do you address those on a startup scale? I mean, that's a really big challenge for a lot of these, younger companies, and especially, they don't have the enterprise back. So what are some of the ways, they can actually, deal with some of this regulation, and how does that impact a InfoSec team in a startup?
That's a great question. So for us, when we looked, so we have a lot of regulation. Not only do we have, HIPAA, we got PII information, we got PHI information. We are high trust certified, so we have to go through that exercise as well. But what we looked at is when you go into a startup, and the startups just think about one thing: let's get product out there, let's see how it's doing, let's mature it after that. They don't think about these things. So to get embedded into that and say, guys, we need to start changing our structure, or at least having processes locked down and actually having policies. In order for us to actually do that was all about education and awareness. It's making the office of the CISO so visible that the users and the development staff, everybody within our organization knew where to go to for a resource when it came to security. And that organically helped us create these policies and these processes that align to SOC 2 Type 2, that align to high trust, that align to PHI and PII, right? Those were the type of things that we had to do. Now, with a startup, you have to do it quickly, right? Everything is operating, everything's about velocity. So in order for you to actually if you're a new CISO going into an environment and security has not been part of that framework, or there really hasn't been a focal point of the organization, the way to get out there is the first thing is to give a face to the office of the CISO, or give a face to the security organization. And that's get in front of your users. Don't send out emails and say, hey, this is security. You have to do X. Get in front of them. Do face-to-face. I've said this for years. Security is and always will be a face-to-face business. You have to get in front of that community so that they know where to go, who to talk to, and they want to partner with you, right? So when we did that, compliance, SOC 2 Type 2, high trust, all of that kind of like fell into place for us. We were able to actually go from 0 to high trust certified in less than 18 months. And to be high trust certified, if for those folks that know what high trust certification is, it is a very, very strenuous compliance process, right? And for us to actually do that all on top of AWS, having 0 data centers, in 18 months, we operated incredibly quickly.
Which brings up a very, which brings up this issue is healthcare, in general, are top targets for hackers. They're easy targets. They have a ton of endpoints, a ton of IoT devices, a ton of vulnerabilities, and they're limited in resources some of the time. Obviously ZocDoc isn't a hospital per se or a clinic, but you guys do operate between the patient and the doctor. How does that impact the way you view InfoSec? How does that impact the way you view threats in general?
So I think our threat is elevated because of that. When you think about it and you say, we are the area where a threat actor can look at and say, I can get to many areas of the healthcare experience, either on the doctor, patient, or hospital side. That's another area that helped us actually elevate the office of the CISO within ZocDoc to give it that importance, because we know it's such a core component of the business. So I think looking at how these threat actors, it isn't like it was 20 years ago. There's so much reconnaissance that is being done when a threat acting group actually targets an organization. They know this. They know that this is something that we do. So how do we think like that and start preparing our environment, our users, to really prepare as they start developing, these applications, these products, so that they're prepared to actually understand that these threats are coming. So how do we defend against that? How are we putting things in place before, ahead of time instead of reactive? I'm a very big proponent of being proactive in our approach to security instead of being reactive. And look, all CISOs want this. But unless you can raise that awareness throughout the organization and have your developer or infrastructure, SRE, DevOps, CTO, all buy into that, it's hard to actually do it.
So you have a master's in Homeland Security. You're a Chief Information Security Officer, and you're a former Marine. How do all of those play into the fact of how you view security?
That's a great question. I think, so I do have a master's in Homeland Security. If you think about the Homeland Security apparatus over the past few years, the threat for cyber has been just increased over the past few years. If you look at the worldwide threat assessment that gets issued every year by the Director of National Intelligence, I think for the past 5 or 6 years, cyber has been identified as the #1 threat to the country. The #1 threat. It tops terrorism right now. And then you can get into cyber terrorism, which is probably another podcast we could talk about. But if you look at warfare right now, any physical warfare that is actually happening, it is absolutely happening in the cyber realm as well. And I think cyber is that new area of, it's not new. I think it's more popular right now. It's that new area where threat actors go to actually start their attack. And if you think about it too, cyber it has crossed over to that physical realm. Like a cyber attack can absolutely get into that physical realm and cause physical damage. Look at critical infrastructure, right? Critical infrastructure right now in the country is some of our power lines are pre-Eisenhower,
Right.
right? So they are totally susceptible to these type of things. And the more and more of those systems are being brought online. And being brought online without having security just opens up the threat more for these threat actors.
That kind of, Homeland Security just recently, issued they said, hey, we're starting the National Risk Center. You have NKIC, you've got DNI, you've got ODNI, you've got so many different divisions in the federal government kind of trying to grasp with what you just said, which is, the true fact of the matter is cyber is the number one threat to our country's infrastructure, to our country in general, not only our businesses, but our country. How does all of that play in your head, and how does, where does that cooperation between private and public kind of need to get in?
That is a great question. I think that is exactly what we've been lacking in the cybersecurity industry is, look, there's information sharing, which is great, but I would love information exchange.
But that's what the NKIC does.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the critical infrastructure for the country, right? Look at which is power, it's telecommunications, it's mass transit, right? Look at the power companies; they're all owned by the private sector, right?
Right.
Look at telecommunications, all owned by the private sector. The private sector needs to have that ability to get intelligence from the government saying this is going to be a threat from this threat acting group. When you have threat actors that are military funded and they are protected and they go after the private sector will lose that battle every single time. If the U.S. government can give us intelligence and actionable information so that we can know how to prepare and protect our environments, it would absolutely help reduce our risk from an organizational perspective.
So there's a hidden gem. So I'm going to stop you real quick because I'm going to tell you there's a hidden gem. It's called the NKIC. I don't know if you heard of them.
Yep.
I literally just did a podcast with John Felker a week ago. We published it last week. And he's the director of the NKIC. And the NKIC is all about information exchange. So they actually want you to give them information, and they're going to kick back information. And so that's just one aspect of it, though, right? So they're kind of giving you information, and you're giving them information, and there's a back and forth relationship there. But again, they kind of get all the information from everywhere in the federal level, and then they kind of distribute it to all their partners.
And which is great. Now, how real time is that information? That's an area we probably have to double click on and say, is this information like what is real time nowadays, too? But anything like if there was a threat acting group that said we're going after the healthcare industry, this is the type of way that we are actually going to go do it, and this is what we're using, right? And if the intelligence community had that information and can synthesize it and get it to a point that they could share it with the private sector rapidly, so that I could adjust my resources and say this is how they're coming after us, right? When I get information that is coming from the intelligence community that is 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks late, it's too late. It's way too late for me to put in my resources within enough time to actually go through it, right?
Right.
So that I would love a little bit more of a real time. And look, maybe I'm asking for too much, but it's a conversation that needs to happen.
Well,
it's an absolute conversation that needs to happen.
We live in a world where we want everything real time, right? And we get a lot of our stuff real time today. Football scores is real time. Traffic updates, you go on Waze, real time traffic updates. You can navigate Manhattan in a heartbeat minute and try to avoid as many of the jams as you possibly can. But then again, right, our federal government sometimes is a little bit slower to react. And, just earlier this week, as you and I are speaking today, but I think it was mid of last week, about a week ago, that, the government kind of issued this new cybersecurity directive about, hacking back, about stopping actors, about launching kind of these attacks and trying to put fear in nation states per se. What's your take on that? I mean, do you feel like that kind of is a deterrent, or do you feel like it's opening Pandora's box?
I think it's the latter. I think it is opening Pandora's box because now it's out in the open. Before it was in the open, but a little bit more clandestine. But I think now it's out in the open. And if you look at these type of attacks that are happening, right? These nation states that are coming after U.S. assets, they're coming after the private sector, right? military versus military and a warfare perspective, that's one. But when you have a cyber military unit from a nation state going after the private sector, we are going to lose that battle every single day of the week. There's no way that I'm going to be able to go up against a nation state with my team and platform and actually win that battle. It's not going to happen. And when we make that open statement that we are going to now activate cyber weapons, or we're going to use more cyber weapons in an offensive way, that could start something that, again, the private sector is not equipped to actually handle.
So that's a common kind of conversation. And last question, I promise, because I know we're getting short on time. But one of the things is, if how comfortable are you as a chief information security officer to kind of allow the government to have a backdoor to help you deal with those kinds of attacks? Is that something that you think the private sector should kind of adapt in the new cyber world? Or is it kind of one of those where we just need to know so we can do our own little thing?
So I think the term backdoor, I think that's just a very touchy subject. I don't believe in the backdoors. I don't think that's
Right.
going to help. I think that healthy information exchange is what is really going to help us as, collectively, right? I think allowing that backdoor or something like that without the proper oversight could be even worse than what we're thinking as a helpful perspective. But I think that healthy information exchange, having those partnerships with the federal government, and like when I come to organizations, the first thing I do is I establish that partnership with my state, local, and federal representatives from a cyber perspective. Go there and I introduce, hey, I'm the CISO for X company right now. Just want to let you know, this is my contact information. Like, you have to have that establish those partnerships so that healthy information exchange actually happens. And one other thing that I wanted to highlight and about, cyber in the federal government, look, if we're starving in the private sector for talent for cyber, I know for a fact the federal government is starving for it as well.
Right.
So when you look at some of these policy changes and some of these decisions, how were they made without having that or maybe not having the full breadth of cyber experience that some folks in the private sector have, right? So those are the type of things that you have to think about when these decisions get made, is like, who was advising those policymakers to saying this is the right thing to do or the right thing to say publicly, right?
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. Listen, I mean, I agree with you. There's a huge talent shortage. I'm hearing of all kinds of ways where people are trying to create cybersecurity entry-level positions with people with little or no IT background, which I still find to be astonishing.
Yeah, it's true. Look, nowadays CISOs are like, hey, if you want to work, we're willing, because we are starving for talent. It's not like we're going to hire anybody off the street, but this is not a job that you take it's not for the faint of heart, right? In cyber, you're going to have to be willing to know that you have to learn how to deal with failure. You're going to have to learn how to deal with compromises, responding to compromises, and having that public a persona that you have to represent the organization, right? This is not a job that is just for the faint of heart. You got to want to actually do this.
Exactly. Perfect. Well, Brian, you and I can keep going on forever, and we probably will do another one just on cyber terrorism. I think that would be really cool. It actually gave me a really cool idea. I jotted it down. So
good stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think cyber terrorism is for the CISO community, they look at it and they go, that's our doomsday, that's our 0 day, right? And but for a lot of people, I don't think they quite comprehend what cyber terrorism is all about. Movies try to make it, but movies are always just that, movies. And so
Yep.
I'd love to have that discussion sometime in the future. Brian, I appreciate your time, man. Thanks for being on the show. It's been awesome having you on.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I look forward to more podcasts.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. That was Brian with ZocDoc. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to be right back after this message. The CyberHub Engage podcast is sponsored by CyberHub Academy. CyberHub Academy are cyber business operation experts, helping any size business operationalize cybersecurity within their organization, whether it be tabletop exercises, security assessments, or building a cybersecurity strategy. For more, go to cyberhubacademy.com. ZocDoc.com.